Hi everybody, welcome to the Jacob Edwards Library. Thank you for coming this evening. We have another program sponsored by the Friends of Jacob Edwards Library and also the Last Green Valley, the Walktober program. And I'm delighted to see people here from not just our community but from other surrounding communities. That always makes it so worthwhile. The program is being taped tonight, as you're aware, so people will be able to check in at a later point as well. So we are thrilled to welcome our three guests this evening who are here to talk to us about that day in 2011 when we all were really shocked and scared. And I'm talking about June 1st, 2011, when this area experienced a tornado. And I was just reading today about some of the impact of it, and it's, you forget. And I'm really thrilled that we have our group of presenters here this evening who are going to talk to us about the ramifications, not just of what actually happened, but future planning and what that means for our environment. And I think that's what we're all interested in. And without further ado, I'm going to just quickly introduce our presenters. We have Danelle Laflower, Jen Santoro, and John Scanlon. Jen Santoro is a graduate of the University of Vermont. Danelle Laflower is a forest ecologist and until recently was with the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And John is here from Mass Wildlife. And I think we're very fortunate to have the various perspectives and all the data that you're going to bring to us. And it'll be a lot to take in for our next hour. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you all for coming. As Margaret said, I'm Danelle Laflower, and this is Jen, and she's a PhD candidate at the University of Vermont right now. So this is her PhD research, and at the time we collected the data, I worked for the DCR, and I had the benefit of collecting data in 2012 and 2017, and I live next to Brimfield State Forest, so this place is near and dear to my heart. What we do request is that you don't ask any questions until after both our talk and John's talk, so that we have plenty of time to hear about John's talk and the birds, which I am sure you all care about. So we have a lot to talk about. We're going to jump right in, and we're going to start with some forestry background. So natural systems are continually in a state of flux, and disturbance gives the opportunity for systems to reset themselves. And in this model of stand development, stage 1, stand initiation, it begins with a disturbance, such as a tornado. Species arrive from seeds, seed banks, which are seeds in the soil, or advanced regeneration, which are the little seedlings and saplings that didn't die in the disturbance. During this stage, resources are ample and mortality is low. Stage 2, stem exclusion, begins when the forest canopy has closed and no light reaches the forest floor, so species are effectively not regenerating. During this stage, mortality occurs for competition for limited resources. Stage 3, understory reinitiation, begins when that mortality opens up gaps in the forest canopy, which allows light to reach the forest floor again, so that reproduction occurs again. During this stage, mortality occurs because of weather, pests, or old age. And the fourth stage is loosely called old growth. It's a multi-age forest with old growth characteristics. So gaps in the canopy are larger, they close more slowly. There's trees of all sizes, not just old trees. And there's also, and this is important, there is standing deadwood, there's deadwood on the ground in various stages of decay. And that makes a more structurally complex forest.
All right, so this complexity is a really good thing. The image on the left is my attempt at art in Microsoft Paint, and shows a forest with a bunch of different tree species. These trees have many different ages. Some are young, some are old. There are many different species, many different heights. And this structural complexity that Danelle was explaining contributes to a really diverse forest, and a forest that is really resilient to disturbance. So this is what we like to see in a forest. We're very lucky up here in New England that a lot of our forests are very diverse and resilient to disturbance. On the other end of the spectrum, we could have a total monoculture of one species, one age, and a disturbance could wipe out this whole forest, and that could be really catastrophic for the ecosystem. So the main message of this is that this complex forest, this structural and compositional heterogeneity, I can never say that word, makes for a really healthy, resilient forest. This is what we're looking for coming back after the tornado. So I'll talk a little bit about natural disturbance because it's kind of the crux of why we're doing this research in the first place. It's any discrete event that alters the ecosystem. This can be small, this can be large, this can be in between sized. Disturbances can be very variable in the area that they disturb, in the size and the severity. The tornado is obviously a very large, very severe disturbance in this region. There are a lot of bad things that come with this. Tornadoes are destructive, they pose danger to humans, and they're very costly to deal with. But there's a silver lining to this. There are some good things. Natural disturbance fosters resilient ecosystems, and it creates a lot of really good habitat for different species. Here with the tornado, we see a lot of early successional habitat opening up, which fosters biodiversity, and John will go into more detail about the birds. But it creates this structural and compositional heterogeneity by creating different age classes and different species in the forest that can help the forest regrow. Here in New England, we mostly have wind disturbance. Usually we just have small-scale wind. It creates little gaps that might knock over a couple trees, and rarely we have hurricanes and tornadoes up here. Climate scientists are predicting that there's going to be an increasing frequency of large disturbances like tornadoes across New England. And we're doing this research because we want to know how to handle these disturbances in the future. If this happens again, how do we react?
So, in natural systems, disturbance is not inherently bad. But in human systems, the devastation can be severe. And you can see this is Hollow Road in Brimfield after the tornado. And we just want to acknowledge the devastation to human systems because that is not what we're talking about, but we do recognize it.
So we'll give a little background on salvage logging. This is a process that removes any dead or fallen or tipped over trees from the ecosystem after some kind of large event. It's popular out west with ecosystems that have a lot of fire. It's also popular here after big wind events like hurricanes and tornadoes. So it's a very common response, and there are a lot of really good reasons to do it. I know Brimfield State Forest cleared a fire break around the perimeter, and that's great for safety reasons. Reduce the risk of fire. You could recover some value from trees that fell over during a windstorm. It could be for aesthetic reasons. This isn't a complete laundry list, but there are a lot of great reasons to do salvage logging. It can come with some negative consequences though, and paramount among these is the idea of compound disturbance. And what I mean by that is the forest exhibits one disturbance. Here we're talking about the tornado. It starts to recover, and we hit it with another disturbance. We go and salvage log it. There could be adverse impacts to that, but it really depends on how you do it and the intensity. I really want to make it clear here that I'm not going to denounce salvage logging. I think it's a great thing that we do it, but we do need to understand the impacts of it if we're going to keep using it going forward. So because we may experience more large disturbances in the future, it's really important right now that we understand the impacts of salvage logging on our forest before we use it as a response to everything. So that's really the reason for doing this research. So we'll get into a little bit about our study area.
So our study area is Brimfield State Forest. It's a 3,500 acre Massachusetts forest reserve. And it's in South Central Mass. The arrow points to the state forest. The map in Massachusetts, the dark green, I hope you can see it. The dark green are all Massachusetts DCR properties, Department of Conservation and Recreation. So, as you know, and as you probably can remember, June 1st, 2011, tornado touchdown in Westfield, Mass. Tracked eastward approximately 38 miles to Charlton, Mass, going directly through Brimfield State Forest. By the time it reached Brimfield State Forest, it was an EF3 tornado with wind speeds between 136 and 165 miles per hour. The tornado affected 927 acres of the forest, so the forest is in this bright green, and you can see the tornado track going through. 618 acres were determined to have heavy damage, and that's the dark purple right here. At the time, the DCR was assigning landscape designations to all of their forests and parks. And so in the spring of 2012, they classified Brimfield State Forest as a reserve. And this is important because it meant that no salvage logging would take place. Where in some of the other management designations, they would have salvage logged. So Brimfield State Forest, the DCR, also took the opportunity to conduct a vegetation survey to look at changes in forest structure. So our study encompasses 3 plot types or strata. The first one, tornado damaged areas within Brimfield State Forest with no salvage logging. Tornado damaged areas outside of Brimfield State Forest with salvage logging. So this is private landowners. The DCR found people who were logging or groups that were logging so that they could use as a comparison. And finally, we have a control group, which are unaffected areas within Brimfield State Forest that we can compare what would happen without the damage. We had a total of 81 plots.
And our general research objectives for this study were to examine forestry growth after this tornado. And we looked at this from 3 perspectives. For the overstory conditions, what was lost and what did we have left after the tornado? How does that compare to the residual forest and the control plots? The regeneration, what's coming back? Is it different or is it greater in certain plot types over others? And the coarse woody debris, all of this wood that was left on the ground in Brimfield State Forest or taken away on the sites that were salvage logged, does that impact the trees or the numbers of seedlings that come back after the tornado? And really overall what we want to learn from this is actions we can take today in reaction to large wind events, tornadoes like these, to ensure that we not only have a healthy and resilient forest in the future, but to help what's the word I want? to help our management practices into the future, to help tell us what to do about this in the future. So Danelle's going to go a little bit into the fieldwork that we did last summer.
Yeah, so briefly, the DCR set up the plots in 2012, and we conducted the initial survey in 2012. We remeasured the same plots in 2017. And on each 1/5 acre plot, we took tree regeneration and coarse woody debris, CWD, for the plots. Basically for trees, we identified the species, we measured height and diameter, and we looked at loss agents, like what damaged the tree. And these included tornado-specific agents, such as if it was leaning more than 45 degrees. We identified species that were regenerating and quantified the amounts, and we took transects of coarse woody debris. So that's a tape measure through the woods, and then all the dead down wood that was under the tape measure, we measured that. So this picture, I hope you can see it well enough, but the whole idea is to show you how difficult it is to walk around in that tornado zone. It is pretty complex on the ground there.
You don't walk in that tornado.
Okay.
Scramble.
It's
Oh, yeah, there you go.
challenging.
Scramble, exactly.
So what did we find out? So what we found was there was a significant decrease in the average number of live trees on the blowdown or the tornado plots in 2017 compared to 2012. And you can see that on this graph. Right here is the tornado. Bright green is 2012 and dark green is 2017. Mean live trees is on the y-axis. But what I really want you to look at is the spatialness of this. So you probably recognize the tornado track now. The circles represent the plots that we measured. The size and color of the circle represents the percent of live trees compared to 2012. So this one right here we're using as a reference. That's 76 to 100% of the trees were still alive in 2017 compared to 2012. So anything bigger than that circle means there's more live trees in 2017. Anything smaller and lighter colored means there's fewer live trees in 2017. And so you can see the high mortality of the blowdown plots. And some of these trees in the control plots, there's actually more trees on the plot than there was in 2012. And you might be able to see, if your eyes are good enough, this little circle in the control, so this anomaly, and this picture shows you what happened here. Beavers dammed a waterway, flooded the plot, and all the trees died. And Jen and her assistant had to collect data from kayaks for that one.
It was a lot of fun.
They were proud of it. So here we're going to look at height as a way to get at vertical structure. So in this box plot right now, we're only looking at the control plots. Height is on the y-axis, and this light green is live trees in 2012, and the darker green beside it is live trees in 2017. And you can see that the height is increasing in the control area, which is what you expect. Trees grow taller. But now I'm going to add the blowdown plots. And here you can see, here's live trees in 2012 and here's live trees in 2017. So you can see a real decrease in height in the tornado zone. And I didn't mention it, sorry, but the horizontal line is the median value. In a box plot, the box is the middle 50% of the data. Anyway, back to live trees in the blowdown zone. The tree height shrunk, and it's been shifted to coarse woody debris, which is the blue box right there. And so what's happened is all those trees that we identified as having a lean greater than 45 degrees in 2012, these trees were heavily damaged, and they were still alive in 2012, but they weren't able to persist. So we see the shift in composition. Oh, and this picture here shows the simple vertical structure that you expect in that stand initiation phase, where there is one age class or cohort and ample resources. So this is in the tornado zone on the top of the hill in Brimfield State Forest. There are species, as Jen mentioned, that depend on early successional habitats such as these. These are important. They're declining species in the area. And so the tornado zone increases the overall diversity of the forest.
All right, so I have a couple slides here of these wonderful bar charts, and this is going to look at the species composition in the different areas of the forest. So the charts on the left show the raw numbers, so what's left, and the charts on the right I normalize by percent composition. So we can see pretty starkly right here that we lost a lot of trees in the blowdown and the salvage plots, and that was all from the tornado and from the salvage operations, taking away anything that had fallen over and might have still been alive. We can also see from this graph that the red areas, red oak, are the dominant tree species in this region. Red oak's one of my favorite trees, so I'm pretty happy about this. We can see that we lost a lot of it too in the blowdown and salvage, and this graph on the left confirms it. Our proportion of live red oak in the overstory is way larger in the unaffected control plots than it is in the blowdown and the salvage plots. So we lost a lot of our big mature red oaks. We can confirm this by looking at the dead trees in each of the plot. So here in blowdown, most of that bar is red for red oaks. So this just confirms from the previous slide, we lost a lot of red oak trees. A huge proportion, as we can see on the left one. Another interesting species to look at is eastern hemlock in the green bars. Eastern hemlock is a mid-story tree. Mostly it hangs out in the shade. It's a wonderful tree. And when these mature red oaks died and fell over, hemlock became the new canopy. So we still do have quite a few eastern hemlock trees hanging out in the tornado zone and in the salvage plots because they weren't knocked over by the wind. But the real metric of what we might get back in the forest in the future is looking at the regeneration. So here I have the trees per acre of different species of regeneration that we found in 2017 on these plots. And you can see that the salvage plots have the most. And that's really encouraging, that regeneration is just screaming back on these plots. It's an open sunlight habitat. There's a lot of room for a lot of species to grow. A lot of this is taken up by these gray bars and the pink. And those two species are black birch and pin cherry. Pin cherry is a really great early successional species. The seeds are great for wildlife. It can be stored in the seed bank for a long time and pop up immediately after these disturbances. And black birch is also a really good post-disturbance species. So a lot of our regeneration in these salvage plots is comprised of disturbance-adapted species, whereas we have a lot of orange or red maple in both the tornado and the control plots.
So this picture here just highlights how much regeneration is really occurring in the tornado zone. This is the exact same location, just taken 5 years apart, where you can see the downed trees, this coarse woody debris in 2012. And here we have 10 feet tall, 12 feet tall trees.
So in addition to the composition of the species that are growing back, it's also really important to look at the diversity of these species. And diversity is in ecology measured by something called Shannon's index, which I believe we ecologists borrowed from physicists, but it explains the amount of difference and, well, diversity in the region. We can see from this box plot here that the blowdown or the tornado plots have the highest species diversity compared to the other plots. So what this means is that a lot of different stuff is coming back in the blowdown plots, and since the diversity is a great metric of forest resilience and health, this is something really exciting to see. We do see slightly lower diversity in the salvage log plots. It's not a huge difference, which is good, but this suggests that the salvage logging operations may have initially homogenized this regeneration composition. We saw a few slides ago that there was a lot of black birch and a lot of pin cherry, and they're coming back in high numbers, which is good, but it's mostly those species. So this means that the blowdown had a lot more different species, whereas the salvage may have been focused on primarily those disturbance-adapted species. So we might be seeing more of those disturbance-adapted species in the future in the salvage log plots, but regeneration can change pretty quickly, and this is something we hope to continue monitoring as the forest grows. All right, this is my favorite slide of the whole presentation. Another way to look at the different species or the different what's coming back is to look at functional traits instead of species. And functional traits are really neat because we're not necessarily looking at the different species like red oak or red maple or white pine. We're looking at traits that they have. So red oak and hickory and American chestnut are all 3 different species, but they share something in common. They have very big, heavy seeds. So high seed mass is a functional trait. Another example is that hemlock and sugar maple, very different trees, but they're both very shade tolerant, so they both have high shade tolerance. So we look at trees kind of in this flipped way by looking at their traits instead of their species to see if any trends pop out. So this is a ordination graph, and what an ordination does is it looks at all of the difference in your data, and it kind of boils it down to 2 major ways to explain it. So it explains the traits on these axes here. And it says, for example, on this y-axis, that high positive values are correlated with high shade tolerance, meaning they have maybe a lot of hemlocks and sugar maples, correlated with high maximum height. Things like white pine have a very high height at maturity, correlated with high flood tolerance and other traits. And we can also see that the green dots and the blue dots, which are control and blowdown points, are very close to each other. In ordination, things being close to each other means they're similar. So our interpretation of this is that control and blowdown plots have very similar functional composition. So even though the heights are different, the forest is a very different place after the tornado, functionally, the blowdown or the tornado zone is compositionally similar to the control, and that's great. We're getting the same functional traits coming back, and this is a mark of a really resilient forest. The salvage plots, I forgot to highlight that. The salvage plots are a little further away from the control and the blowdown, but they're on the move. These two up here are stable between 2012 and 2017, and the salvage plots are moving up, moving perhaps towards higher shade tolerance and higher maximum heights. So 2 points a trend does not make. And as we collect more data, it would be really interesting to see if the salvage plots move closer to the blowdown and control, and that would be a mark of resiliency in those plots too. Just like we looked at species diversity, we can look at functional diversity as well. And here, salvage plots actually look a little bit higher than both blowdown and control. So even though their species composition is a little more homogeneous, their functional composition is a wider variety of traits. So it's kind of a seesaw, but this is a good sign to see that there's high diversity in this aspect of the forest. This is another great trend to monitor over time. The final thing we looked at was coarse woody debris volume, which Danelle explained how he collected that data. So my duh moment of the night is that there's more coarse woody debris in the plots that were hit by the tornado than any other plots, because we picked it up in the salvage sites and there's not a lot in control to begin with. The question here is, does all this coarse woody debris affect how the regeneration is coming back? Does it affect what species or traits come back? So to look at this, I plotted the volume of coarse woody debris on the x-axis against this diversity measure again. And we can see a trend, albeit a bit of a weak one, but a trend towards higher species diversity in the regeneration when there's more coarse woody debris on the ground. So maybe this coarse woody debris has a protective effect. Maybe it prevents deer browse, because I don't think deer can climb over a pile of logs. I barely could, and I don't have hooves. Maybe the decaying wood makes a great soil environment or holds moisture in, and that's a great place for trees to regenerate. So a lot of hypotheses there. So this graph suggests that seedling diversity is higher on sites that have more of this coarse woody debris left on the ground. But we do see this gray area in the middle, where some of the salvage plots in red are intermixed with some of the tornado plots in blue. And this suggests that on salvage sites where we leave some of that coarse woody debris, but pick up some of it, we can get very similar species diversity levels to if we do nothing and just leave all of the coarse woody debris on the ground. And that's a really promising sign for getting diverse regeneration back into these forests. All right, so the next, I think, 3 slides we've got left in this will kind of sum up our research and talk about a few implications for management. So one of our main findings is that these seedlings and saplings are screaming back really rapidly in the blowdown and salvage plots. We love seeing this. The forest is resilient to this change. Things are coming back. We're getting a forest back. Meanwhile, we're getting a diverse habitat that's home to a lot of cool bird species. We're really happy about this. The salvage log sites do have slightly lower species diversity, slightly higher functional diversity. This indicates that the future forest may not be as diverse or may skew towards those disturbance-adapted species, but we're still only 6 years, I guess 7 years now, out from the tornado, so it's really early to tell. And finally, the tornado has left a really patchy distribution of vegetation on this landscape. There's still a lot of a forest that was not affected. There's forest that was affected. And this is really great from a habitat heterogeneity perspective. This provides great habitat for early successional species and landscape diversity, which contributes to overall landscape resiliency. So our main take-home messages for tonight: we can't avoid natural disturbance. It's going to happen, but we can plan for it. There are positives, there are negatives, and we're going to have to be prepared for more frequent disturbances. What we do after them will matter. We also know that diversity is really important for forest resilience. Trees are going to outlive all of us, so whatever we do today, our grandchildren are going to see. Adding this structural complexity and heterogeneity increases not just habitat variability, but forest health and forest resilience. You can think of this like a stock portfolio. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket when you're investing. You want to diversify your assets. Same thing for a forest. You want to diversify your species, your functional traits, and that makes something more resilient to disturbance. And finally, we have an impact on forest recovery. The things we do or don't do affect how the forest comes back. Even inaction, like what Brimfield State Forest did by leaving it all on the ground. That's a deliberate management decision that we make. Sometimes less is more. And finally, we need to plan and act today so we have a healthy, resilient forest in the future. Some action items from this research might be to practice lower intensity salvage logging, leaving some sites that are reserves with a lot of dead wood on the ground and some sites where you pick up a lot of it. This habitat heterogeneity is great for the ecosystem. And similarly, this dead wood on the ground may help to increase the sapling and seedling diversity that comes back. So that patchy distribution is important to maintain that diversity into the future. So overall, our main take home from this research is, in order to retain a diverse and heterogeneous forest in the future, we need to work on that today. And hopefully some of this research contributes to management actions. I hope we don't get another tornado, but if we do, I'd like to think we're a little more prepared in forest management after this one. So we're going to turn it over to John. A lot of people helped out with this research at UVM, at DCR, at Mass Wildlife, and it would not have happened without having the entire team to tromp around those blowdown plots and do the bird study. So I'm very grateful to everyone who's contributed to this research. And that's that.
All right. I'm glad Jen had that last slide on there. There was actually one partner that was left off it, and I didn't think about it either, is the Massachusetts chapter of the Nature Conservancy jumped in with us, but that was before Jen's time, so it's not blaming her for it. When the tornado struck in 2011, and we got a sampling effort organized for 2012, that was the DCR and Mass Wildlife, some help from Norcross Wildlife Foundation, Massachusetts chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and the U.S. Forest Service Northeast Research Station at UMass Amherst, and you'll be seeing some of their results here tonight. So we really just cobbled a bunch of folks together and put this study on the ground. Before I get into the specific songbird results, I thought it was important, the way these ladies started off, was to acknowledge the sort of devastating human toll that this natural disturbance resulted in. Mass Wildlife, we have a small management area in McKinstry Brook here in Southbridge, at least partially in Southbridge, nowhere near the size of Brimfield State Forest, but we have a lot of neighbors adjacent, and some of them lost their entire houses, and there's just no way to really overstate the impact. And I do want to make a point that on the state wildlife lands, we took two actions. One, even though the McKinstry Brook Wildlife Management Area is not a reserve, Mass Wildlife does have forest reserves where there's no commercial harvesting, but McKinstry Brook is not one of them. Still, we decided to leave the tornado impact area alone just because we felt it had study value and provided some habitat structure, as you just heard about. But we did do a couple of things. One is that we contacted the adjacent landowners, anyone who had property like infrastructure, because the downwood can potentially present a fire danger until things green up, and we allowed anyone who wanted to clear a certain ways onto the state wildlife land if they felt they would benefit from doing that. The other folks we worked with was the town highway departments, saying that, you know, our preference is to leave the downwood alone, but there is McKinstry Brook flowing through the Mass Wildlife property, and so we contacted the town highway department and said, look, if you have any concerns about some of the downwood coming loose and potentially clogging up a culvert or a bridge or something like that, and you want us to come and work with us and remove anything that you see as a hazard, certainly we're going to do that. So those are the active responses that we took, but in terms of the blowdown itself, we left it all intact. So what do I do to move forward? Just top one?
Oh, the right arrow.
The right.
Okay. Now, one of the reasons we were so interested in Mass Wildlife in this event is that currently, where we are at this point in history is that we don't have a lot of young forest habitat in Massachusetts. All right, we have some 3 million acres of forest in Massachusetts, and 100 years ago we had plenty of young forest habitat, but today we don't have an awful lot. About 3.5% of our total forest land in Massachusetts is less than 20 years old. Okay, and as a result, many wildlife species that utilize this post-disturbance habitat are in long-term population decline. Some of them are on the state endangered species list, all right? And most of the species that utilize this post-disturbance type habitat have been identified as species of conservation need in our Massachusetts State Wildlife Action Plan, which you can find on just by Googling that name. It's a pretty substantial document, but it comes at wildlife from both a community habitat standpoint and a species structure. So there's actually a lot in there. So just two examples. This is throughout the whole Northeast. There's an annual breeding bird survey that's been conducted since the 1960s. It's headed up by the U.S. Geological Survey. And just two examples here of songbirds that key in on these post-disturbance habitats. Okay, the prairie warbler on the left and the eastern whippoorwill on the right. All right, and these are just these population trends are pretty alarming. Okay, the slickers are the average, and you have your confidence intervals outside. So the middle lines are the ones to focus on. And from a population ecology standpoint, these declines are not sustainable. Right? Think if it was our population that was looking like this, you say, you know, we need to step in and do something. So this is a quick summary of what Massachusetts looks like today from a wildlife habitat perspective. Okay, we've recently completed the first statewide mapping of wildlife habitat types. All right, and so all of this upland forest is mature full canopy forest, as are our forested swamps, and as are most of our riparian forest. So all of this is full canopy forest, right? That's fine. This little triangle here represents our young forests and shrublands, okay, the 3.5% that we talked about, right? all of these types provide viable wildlife habitat. But our job at Mass Wildlife is to keep common species common while we create conditions for rare and declining species to become more common. It's definitely a balancing act, right? So we would like more of this. How much more is a pertinent question, right? So I included these habitat goals, which were developed strictly from a wildlife perspective. Based on all extensive literature, if we could snap our fingers and have the landscape look a certain way, we'd have 20 to 25% of our landscape in some combination of post-disturbance habitats, grasslands, shrublands, young forests, okay? Now, importantly, we would have the bulk, the majority, like 60 to 70% in full canopy forest, just like we have it now, okay? And we'd also like to see 10 or 15% in essentially an old growth type of condition, because that has some unique habitat benefits, all right? So this is sort of the idealized picture where all native species would maintain healthy, resilient populations. This is where we actually stood as of 2001, all right, where only about 5% of the state wildlife lands were in grassland, shrubland, or young forest, and we had very little old growth, really mature type forest. So we've been working to get here, and despite all the work we've done, we have made some progress, okay? Most of this has been on the grassland and shrubland edge. So what I want to do now is just focus in, the next slide, focus in on this portions of the graph, all right? So this is where we would like to be. This graphic is only accounting for about 25% of all our land, but we want a couple percent in grassland, 6 or 8% in shrubland, and 10-12% in young forest at any given point in time. That's an idealized. This is where we were in 2001. This is where we were as of last year. We've done a lot of work with grassland and shrubland habitats, and some with young forest. And the reason I want to show this is that people in Massachusetts typically protest when we do forest harvesting for wildlife. I get it. And I show this to make the point that we only want so much in that condition. And at any given point in time, we do want the majority of our forest, just like you see it now. All right, back to the study. We used these automated recording units to record bird song. The best time for sampling breeding songbirds begins about a half hour before sunrise and ends about a half hour after sunrise. Birds will call continually throughout the day and night, but the peak of singing is that right pre and post sunrise period, right? So we established 83 randomly selected points across the 3 treatment areas that we talked about before: the tornado damage without salvage, the tornado damage with salvage, which was all on private lands, and then to control the areas immediately outside the tornado impact area that were of the same forest type of the damage. All right. And so what these recorders did was they're programmed to turn on for a period of 10 minutes. Okay. And we did all of our sampling during the month of June, which is the peak of songbird breeding activity. We sampled the first 3 years, 2012, 2013, 2014. Because this is when you're going to see some really sharp changes. Took a couple of years off and then sampled again in 2017. probably try to go back in either 2019 or 2020. So a quick summary is that the first 3 years of data is what have had the most analysis at this point. We only have a little bit of results from the 2017 work, but I'll share those with you at the end. But as a general finding, okay, there was higher diversity, okay, in the tornado and salvage area compared to the control points. Now, that's not really all that surprising because you have more diverse structures, especially in the damaged area that were not logged. All right. But a major point here is that many of the young forest species, okay, that were not found in the control areas, but many of the bird species that we typically associate with mature forest were found in the tornado damage and even in the salvage logged areas. So that was a surprise, and so we're trying to figure out why that is. Okay, now these graphics are a little complicated, but let's just take them apart one species at a time. This is looking at a subset of songbirds that are, if you looked up in the bird books, they would tell you these are birds of mature forest habitats. Okay, things like black and white warbler, scarlet tanager, wood thrush. Okay, and across the bottom here we have our three treatment types: the tornado areas that were left unsalvaged, the salvage areas, and the control or undamaged areas. So just as a group, without even thinking about individual species, you can see that this group of seven species that are all considered mature forest nesting birds, all right, they were found across all three treatments. Now there was some, which was a surprise. All right, there's a couple of really interesting things here. One of our mature forest species that is in long-term decline is the wood thrush. Okay, this this green bar here. All right, it's a forest nesting, mature forest nesting bird. So sure enough, it's in the control areas. They also occurred to some degree in the salvage areas, but they occurred at almost twice that rate in the tornado areas that were blown down and not salvaged. Okay. Now this is supposed to be a mature forest bird, so why is it here in the tornado areas? Things like red-eyed vireo is probably our most common songbird in Massachusetts. Okay, and sure enough, red-eyed vireos, the control areas are full of red-eyed vireos. Right? Salvage areas still had some, and the tornado damage areas had almost as many vireos as the mature undamaged forest. That was like a major, like, oh, don't these birds read the books? You're not supposed to be here. And the birds, I think, are turning around and say, don't you read the books? A blown down area that is not salvaged is, from a wildlife perspective, is still an intact ecosystem. Still, the structural diversity is actually increased over the pre-disturbance condition. And so I find this stuff pretty fascinating. Again, all these results are preliminary, but happy to share with you what we have. I mentioned that the wood thrush here is an example of a forest nesting bird that is in decline. One reason we think they're declining is that after their young are fledged, they preferentially seek out these post-disturbance habitats to give insects and fruits for their young to fatten up on for that first migration flight. And because we're down to 3.5%, there's not enough places for them to take their post-fledging. Okay, so let's look at songbirds who are traditionally associated with post-disturbance, young forest habitats, right? So we have our prairie warbler and our chestnut-sided warbler. No great surprise here, okay, that these species who need these post-disturbance habitats basically don't show up in the control areas, the undisturbed areas. And an important thing is, at least in the early years, 2012, 13, 14, a lot more abundance and diversity in the unsalvaged areas versus the salvaged areas. Now, in fairness, the salvaged areas, I bet when we get this 2017 data analyzed, you'll see quite a bit of increase here, right? But the take-home point from this slide is that the post-tornado conditions in the unsalvaged areas were seen by songbirds, both as mature forest and as young forest. Why? Well, because it is. You still have some mature forest characteristics, and you still have a lot of young, thriving regeneration. But we really didn't expect to see things to this degree. Okay, so we're still looking at young forest birds here across the first 3 years. All right, in the tornado impacted areas. This is where there was no salvage. No great surprises here. At the bottom here, this is field sparrow, all right? And there are very few field sparrows detected because they really do need open conditions. We did see a lot of field sparrows in the salvage areas, okay? But other early successional birds, okay, like prairie warblers here, okay, this is chestnut-sided warblers, indigo buntings. They were very abundant in the blowdown areas that did not have salvage logging. And one thing really interesting we found was whippoorwills, which are a state-listed bird, okay, because they're associated with post-disturbance habitats and their population levels are so low. They jumped right in the first year afterward. They actually declined the second year. We're not really sure what was going on. It may have just been a detection thing, because these are morning samples and they're better sampled than the evenings. But I wanted to point out what happened the third year after. Is this is a state-listed species, all right? And look at the population trend. And in 2017, we definitely that number is going to be higher yet. Okay, so what about the salvage areas, which, as you heard earlier, were initially the salvage treatments tends to homogenize, right, and limit the species diversity, but that will change over time. And what this graphic shows you is those songbirds traditionally associated with post-disturbance, young forest habitat, chestnut-sided warbler, field sparrow, prairie warbler, indigo bunting. Right after salvage was done, there's just not much there, right? But it doesn't take long, just 1 and then 2 years later, the abundance of these young forest birds just jumped right up, okay? All right, so looking at tornado points versus the salvage point. So this is unsalvaged versus salvaged. okay? And some of the differences here are that the unsalvaged areas had some of the major young forest species, prairie warbler, chestnut-sided warbler, and the it's now called the eastern whippoorwill, okay? So the salvage points did have higher use by most of the young forest species. And the field sparrow, which we mentioned before, was much more common in the salvage areas because they really need that wide structure. One thing that was interesting was that the salvage areas, we initially predicted that's where the whippoorwills would be attracted to. But at least as of 2014, which is 3 years, they're much more abundant in the unsalvaged areas. I guess it's another case of the birds not reading the books, but it's why it's important to do this kind of basic research, because some of this stuff is just like we're scratching our heads trying to figure it out. Okay, so the last thing in terms of findings, everything we've looked at up till now has been 2012, 2013, 2014. But from Lindsay Stevenson, who's with the U.S. Forest Service station in UMass Amherst, she was in one of the last picture that you saw. She just got some of her results to me this morning. And so just a couple of items for the 3 different treatment areas. For the control areas, the forest that was not impacted directly by the tornado, but is right outside it, okay? In 2016 and 2017, red-eyed vireos were the most abundant bird, and as they were back in 2012, 13, and 14, okay? But the one thing we notice is that ovenbirds, while still common in 2016 and 17, were for some reason not as abundant as they were when the study first started. We're not sure why that is. One reason could be because of some of the gypsy moth overstory canopy opening, but that's, we're not sure about that. In the tornado damage areas that were not salvaged, all right, eastern towhees, which are a young forest bird that are a species of conservation concern because they're in long-term decline, all right, was the most abundant bird in the tornado damage areas, okay? So even though there was no cutting, okay, there was just a natural disturbance. Eastern towhee was in 2016 and 2017, was the most frequently detected bird in the tornado, the unsalvaged tornado areas, okay? Other species like chestnut-sided warbler, which are a post-disturbance species, were still present in 2016 and 2017, but already their use is beginning to decline. And the reason for that is these species that key in on these post-disturbance habitats are real specialists. They're looking for very exacting conditions. And because the forest is so resilient and recovers so quickly, things may be great for a chestnut-sided warbler for 2, 3, 4, 5 years after disturbance, but you get beyond that and not for me anymore. I'm looking for the next disturbance patch, which we don't have that many of these days, and that's why they're a species of conservation concern. Okay, salvage areas. What I found interesting is that In 2016 and 17, now that the salvage areas have had time to respond and the vegetation structure is coming back, eastern towhee is the most frequently detected bird in both the salvaged areas and the unsalvaged areas. And it's like, how can a single species be the most common in both of these? Because you stand there, if we stood there and look at, here's the salvage area and here's unsalvaged, it just looks so different. But eastern towhee doesn't see it that way. Why? I can't answer that one. All right. So prairie warblers, field sparrows, very common in the salvage areas in 2016 and 17, but they're already declining in the unsalvaged areas because there's just too much vegetation for them. So again, it points to the fact that we need this heterogeneous, diverse landscape. All right. So a couple of take-home points is that the unsalvaged tornado areas, all right, they offer some really unique habitat features that don't occur elsewhere on the landscape. And it's such a unique situation is that it is appealing to both what we classify as mature forest and young forest birds at the same time. In no other habitat types that I've seen in southern New England do you get this combination of mature forest breeding birds and post-disturbance breeding birds. All right. So in the unsalvaged tornado areas, without question, from a human perspective, we talked about the devastating damage. Okay, but from a wildlife perspective, we shouldn't use the word damaged. Okay, because wildlife see these areas as like a fantastic opportunity. One thing we noticed at the McKinstry Brook area in 2012 was the incredible wildlife use. Jen actually mentioned about, I don't know if white-tailed deer can get around in there. Well, we actually found that in 2012 at McKinstry Brook, white-tailed does were seeking this area out to have their fawns. And we were stunned because we're clambering and suffering and cursing and to get move 100 yards into this area, and then there's all these deer beds and this intensive browsing on the initial regeneration. We had black bears in there on the raspberries and looking at pulling apart the downed trees looking for ants and stuff, and wild turkeys were abundant in there, and it's like, I guess they don't mind. So let's see. So the damaged areas, I can't stress this enough, they are so stable. Okay, on McKinstry Brook site again, we monitored the water quality in the brook, right, and found that despite this incredible damage, all the trees along the brook were just laid down. Some of them were like natural bridges over the brook. Those are the ones that we were concerned could come loose and clog a culvert, and hey, we'll take those out if we need to. But the water quality was like pristine. There's no erosion, all right? Because even though the amount of damage from our perspective was exceptional, it was a very stable site. Okay, there was no erosion. The seedbed immediately responds. All right. So over time, the salvage areas show the biggest changes because they've had the biggest vegetation change. The vegetation went from mature forest to nothing and now is coming back, slightly homogenized, not quite the same species diversity, but still overall, it's gone through the biggest change. And last point is that we refer to the control areas of mature forest just outside the tornado area, but the only constant in natural systems is change, right? And the control areas really aren't control areas. We've had some substantial overstory oak mortality just in the past 2 years from gypsy moth, okay? So we're going to be seeing changes in both vegetation structure and wildlife use of these control areas, which aren't supposed to be changing. But the reality is that in the natural world, everything is constantly changing. I think that is all I have. Indeed it is. I do want to give a shout out to Drew Vitz, who is our state ornithologist. All the bird data you saw here is all from Drew. I run the habitat program for Mass Wildlife, so it's my job to create conditions that are lacking for the species in long-term decline. So people like Drew and the natural heritage folks will come and say, hey, species X and Y and Z, they're really taking it on the chin. It's because we don't have these conditions, and you go make those conditions here. So, okay, I can do that, but I look to people like Drew and the ecologists and the heritage program to identify the most pressing habitat needs. So with that, I think we can open it up for any questions about any of the information you heard tonight.
I have a couple of comments. This tornado taught me that New England is truly a tree-growing factory.
Oh, yeah.
And I say that because twice a day, every day, I go along one portion of the path, 39 miles long, I believe it was, and in just 7 years, it's amazing how the regeneration that's occurred. And an interesting fact, and fortunate or unfortunate as it may be, human regeneration has also taken place along that path line. So there's two cases where one being new housing lots have been built along the path line, and in another case they put solar panel fields up, which I found very unique. But again, that's one case of human as opposed to natural regeneration.
Yeah.
And then John, a comment on birds and how this twister directly connected myself with the bird world. I was in Worcester when the tornado came through town. Where my home is about a half mile from the path line, or where my home was at the time. Fortunately, no damage to speak of at my home, but within that half mile north of me, 4 homes are destroyed and over 20 houses severely damaged. So it was close to 4 hours, what normally is a 40-minute ride from Worcester to Southbridge. It was almost 4 hours to get home that night because I couldn't find an open road to get off to Charles Street and then off the street I live. So I finally get home. It's almost 9 o'clock at night. Unlock the front door, go to turn on the lights, and of course there's no power. I was dive bombed by a bird in the house when I got inside the kitchen.
I need to take cover.
And I said, and I've always had a lot of hair, and I felt something flutter. I said, what the hell was that? So I go running downstairs where my brother's apartment was, and I says, Joe, you gotta come up with me. I believe there's a bird in the house. Now, the mystery is every window and door in the house was sealed shut. So how did this bird get in? And anyone have an idea?
That'd be the chimney.
And the chimney was sealed.
Oh.
On the west side of the house, there's a vent, and that vent leads up to some ductwork that attaches to the second floor bathroom ceiling fan. And the way I figured this out is there were feathers up in that ring. My brother helped me get the bird out of the house, but the mystery was unraveled a bit more when a neighbor who's an avid bird watcher said that again, I wasn't home, but she was. Shortly before she ran in the basement as the funnel was approaching, she saw flocks of birds flying for their lives away from the approaching system. Well, that's one that didn't get away, he got into my bathroom. So there you go. But thank you, great presentation.
Oh, wow.
True story.
That's quite a story.
Yeah.
Wonderful book.
Yeah.
Where's
Yes.
McKinstry Brook? What
McKinstry,
part of Southbridge is it in?
McKinstry, I'm embarrassed to say I haven't been there since, that first year after the tornado. I am blanking on the name of the road that the parking area is.
Near the airport.
Yeah, there you go, right across from.
I don't know if it's called Airport Road, I'm not sure, but the road that comes from town to the airport, it parallels the trail.
Right,
So you can see, actually can see down into the valley of the brook from the road.
exactly, because now that you say that, it spurs my memory that what happened when the tornado came, it came through the Brimfield State Forest, and it was on the ground, obviously, and stayed on the ground through McKinstry Brook, but on the east side of McKinstry Brook, just before the airport, the Southbridge Airport, the land rises, and the bottom of the funnel hit that, and the tornado jumped, and the airport, I believe, if I recall correctly, suffered very little damage. All those light fixed-wing aircraft are sitting there. Meanwhile, a quarter mile away, somebody's house is like totally destroyed. How did that airplane stay there? Well, because the landform popped the tornado up, and then it came back down again.
Well, they did have damage at the airport.
They did.
Yeah.
Yeah, mostly
A couple of
debris,
planes were
though.
flipped over.
A couple, but a lot of them were undamaged, especially compared to the
Oh, yes,
houses.
yeah.
Yeah,
When you talked about, Jen, when you talked about planning and if this were to ever happen again, what do you mean? Because, if you're talking about diversification, I think what's going to come in is what's going to come in naturally, and the only way that you could change that is if you were going to, do some of your own seeding or some of your own planting of little, what do you call them?
Little seedlings.
Seedlings, little
yeah.
saplings, yeah. That would be the only way, because nature is just going to do what nature does, but I don't know how you would say you're going to plan something if it were to happen again.
Right, and I probably could have phrased that better. It's planning for what we do after the tornado. So whether we do,
Well, that's-
whether we leave reserves the size of Brimfield, whether we leave more or fewer, whether we salvage log more intensely or less intensely. And as the years keep going and we keep monitoring this site, if we do see the salvage and blowdown plots are growing apart, they're getting more different, or if they're getting more similar, that could help inform us on how we do any cleanup efforts, if we do cleanup efforts. So,
Yeah, it would have to be after the fact.
It would have to be after the
fact. But as far as getting
Yeah.
diversification, the only way you would probably get it is if you interfere with Mother Nature and
right.
do some of your own seeding and some of your own saplings.
Right. And I think this goes along with the birds too. What it seems like right now is we are still getting a lot of diversity in the salvage sites, which is good, and that tells us that the management that the state of Massachusetts took after this tornado did not veer the forest off onto a totally different path. So it was appropriate management action to take. So something similar, if this were to happen again, this would be a guide to say, this is appropriate management action. But that leaving these reserve sites, like we had the opportunity to do at Brimfield, is also a really good idea for bird diversity, for forest structural diversity, and that it isn't common to leave those reserve sites. And this is a really unique study in this case, and I think we should have prefaced it with that, is that some other studies of tornadoes in Pennsylvania and I think the Midwest, everything is cleaned up afterwards. So you don't get to compare what happens when you clean it up or if you just leave it. So this study allows us to do that. So if there were huge differences, that would kind of maybe point us in one direction or the other. If this were to happen again, maybe we want to pick very carefully the areas we salvage log, so we have really heterogeneous forests. Maybe we don't salvage log all in this area and leave all this area unlogged. Maybe we make it really patchy. So some of these metrics of patchy habitat distribution could play a role in where the state decides to log and where they decide to just leave it. So that's I think what I was trying to get at with the post-disturbance management actions and what we do after this. If there's another tornado anywhere in the state, what we do after it will matter for the species diversity, both birds and trees coming back.
I would think that when you don't salvage anything and you just leave it there, there's just so many more bugs for the birds to eat. You know, there's just so many more bugs.
Sure.
Well, yeah, in the dead wood, that's
Right.
In the dead,
That much
in the
about
dead
bugs,
rotting wood.
yeah.
But the bugs are also breaking it down to make the humus
Yeah.
for the seedlings.
Exactly.
And so,
And that's really good for regeneration.
you know, and as driving on this road, if I come into, go into a Sturbridge and I would see even this many years later, the dead trees still standing up
Yeah.
looking like sore thumbs, and I always wonder why don't they take them down, but
Do you see like woodpecker holes or cavities that birds or wildlife can live in though in these dead trees?
oh, I'm sure.
I mean,
but
they
I'm
provide
driving and I
habitat,
just-
yeah.
Yeah, so it was a purpose in just leaving them, they didn't want to make it look nice and,
Right.
If you think about it as wildlife habitat, you might actually look at it differently. Like
Oh,
when
yeah.
I see those trees, I think it's great. I see beauty in them, you know, so it's our perspective.
And it's a balance too. I mean, if that tree was next to your driveway and it's dead and it's rotting, that might be one you want to take out. You know, if you enjoy having a roof and a car parked in that driveway, like that's a human hazard as well. So I think the beauty of these big reserves that, especially in large areas like Brimfield State Forest, is we're not, if the dead tree falls in the forest, the birds are there to hear it and take advantage of it. It's not going to impact humans quite as much in this big reserve. But yeah, I think I heard a statistic somewhere that a dead tree is almost, at times in certain habitats, more useful to a diversity of wildlife than a live tree.
Wow.
Which it hurts me a little to say that as someone who loves live trees, but I will defer to the wildlife and insect folks on that one.
Well, to follow that up, and to address the question you asked in terms of how can we use this research to maybe do things a little different after the next tornado hits, is one of the most compelling items to come out of Jen's research is that in the salvage areas, we understand, especially on private land, you want to salvage economic value. But a lot of the, what we see as aesthetically displeasing, in addition to the economically valuable blown down timber, most of the salvage sites just took everything out, salvaged the logs they could. A lot of that material went through the chippers, okay?
It's not as valuable.
Right, not nearly as valuable. In fact, probably didn't even pay its way out of the woods. And so one thing we might do is just, if and when this happens again, to provide private landowners with the information that, hey, it's your land, got to respect private property rights. We expect you to take the economic value, salvage the economic value that you can, but just so you know, leaving the really mangled stuff that you're not going to get paid for is actually a major structural habitat benefit. Aesthetically, people don't like to look at it. But if you want to think about what is the biggest, let me just ask this as an open question, what is the biggest difference in forested ecosystems in southern New England today versus, say, 400 or 500 years ago, right? If we went out to the Brimfield Forest right now into one of the control areas where it was big mature trees, beautiful big oak trees, all right? And then we could step into a time machine and go back 500 years and be in a big beautiful oak forest. What would be the first thing that we would notice?
On that note, it's a very good ending to our wonderful presentation this evening. Thank you to our three presenters this evening for coming and for educating us on tornadoes and what to expect and what maybe we can do to plan for the next inevitable tornado, I suppose. So thank you, John, Jen, and Danielle. Thank you very much for coming.